So up to this point, we've done React for a couple weeks now. We've done state management entirely manually, meaning that each component has its own individual state. An article list had its own individual state. An article teaser had its own individual state. An article had its own individual state. But there's some shortcomings when it comes to that. And we've been primarily dealing with writing software in the MVC model. So who can explain to me what MVC is? Because this may or may not be an interview question. What does model view controller mean? Like so MVC stands for?
So it's like how the stuff works together. Like the model is dealing with the stuff in the database. Mm-hmm. The views, the HTML, and the controller has all of the functions that work with both.
Yep, that's pretty much it. Yeah, so MVC stands for Model View Controller. Those are 3 different layers of your web application. So as a user, I take some sort of action. It hits the controller. The controller will talk to some sort of model. The model will go talk to the database, come back, and then go out to some sort of view. The view is exactly what shows up on the screen. Model talks to the database and controller. It contains all the business logic in between. And MVC works for most people and most companies. Right? There's if let's say you're going to start a company tomorrow, you're most likely going to follow the MVC model because that's probably all that you need. But as your company starts to grow, let's say it really takes off and you become like the next Facebook or the next Airbnb or something, MVC is going to start falling apart, as you can kind of see in this picture right here. So I don't know if you remember this from a few years ago. When you logged into Facebook, there's a Facebook messaging chat app, right? Like you would log into Facebook, you would see a notification over the little messages and you'd click on it and you'd read your messages, right? And it should go away. And then all of a sudden you realize when you refresh the page, that message is still there. Like that notification is still there, but you've already read the message, right? So that becomes an issue. And this became like a buggy cycle for many Facebook users and a buggy cycle for many Facebook developers who are also Facebook users. The issue with that is the way that data is flowing through the application. When you have an app as large as Facebook, MVC is not really scalable. So for us, usually when you do action controller like MVC, like the user takes some sort of action, hits the controller, the routes, and then it'll update maybe 1 or 2 models and bring out one particular view. But this is more or less what it was going to start looking like when you deal with a Facebook size. Like when you hit some sort of action, it'll hit some sort of controller. It might update 6 or 7 models, which will update like 6 or 7 different views. So the data is not as, it was not flowing through like correctly. And then when the view that you got may not have been updated, it may not have been updated in the database quite yet. There were many different things to kind of keep track of. It kind of looks like a kind of a nightmare. So once they figured out like this is where the shortcoming was, they decided to create a new simple streamlined solution, then something called unidirectional data flow, and they called this Flux. So this type of like to go from this MVC model to unidirectional flow, which is basically one is much cleaner than the other one, and they called this architecture Flux, and then that's what Redux was based off of. So instead of going from one action to a controller to update 1,000 models to update 15 different views, what happened was I'm a user, I take some sort of action, that action is dispatched, and then it goes into like a centralized store, like a centralized database, and then that updates the view. So it goes in one direction. There is a developer named Dan Abramov. Yeah, now I think he's at Facebook. I don't understand this personally, like how some people are just so young and so smart. Like, so this is the engineer who helped create Redux, like probably the primary like contributor behind the Redux library. And as you'll see today, it kind of like revolutionized the idea of state management on inside of React. I don't know how old this person is, but it doesn't look like any older than like early 30s, and it wrote this, and I just don't understand. But this is the creator of of Redux and the create React app generator that we use every single time that we have it. According to Abramov, based on the documentation, Redux is, quote, a state management library with minimal API, but completely predictable behavior, so it is possible to implement logging, hot reloading, time travel, universal apps, record, and replay without any buy-in from the developer. So, suffice it to say, it's just like it does a lot of stuff, like really, really well. So let's get started with this. So I'm going to jump over here, load up iTerm real quick. What's that?
That's me.com.
No, you can get me.com too.
No, I mean, that's like the old Apple one.
Yeah, it's the old Apple one. Some people, I've met one person who is part of the Agile Manifesto, named Alistair something. What's there? Alistar. One of the people on the manifesto who created Agile still has an AOL email address, but they've earned the right to have that because they've been in technology for so long. Yeah. All right, so let's get started. So there's three major principles of Redux that we need to keep track of. So before, all the state was on different components, right? If I go into, let me load up news site. Let's go to Platoon, go to React. Let's go to news site 5. And if I go into my different components here, like an app nav or something like that, well, app nav does not have its own state. Does article have its own state? Article list have its own state? What happened? Okay.
Your pages.
It's in my pages. Here we go. So each individual React component has its own state, right? So this add article had its own state. This article had its own state, homepage, login, and section. They all had their own state, and they each managed their own state. This kind of gets a little bit like hairy later down the road because it's kind of like what if I wanted to repeat, like have 2 section pages, each with their own individual state? Like you have to keep track of like which components are out on your website and which components states are available. So what we do instead is, instead of having each individual component keeping track of its own state, state is all managed in one giant, it's called an immutable store. You can think of this as like a client-side database. So on your client-side machine, there is a centralized database that will now keep track of all the state across the entire app that you're going to use.
Just clarifying that example you give. Like, doesn't it create a new object every time you?
It does create a new object, but the thing that keeps track of that new object every single time is the individual component. So instead of having like, now you have like one central point of truth for all things state, rather than each individual component controlling its own state. So that's the first thing you need to know. State is all controlled in like basically one giant client-side database. The second thing is that actions are going to trigger changes. So when a specific person takes one particular action, that's what's going to trigger the change. And then finally, state is going to be changed by a concept called reducers, which we'll talk about in just a little bit.
You made this all in JavaScript?
What's that?
You made it all in JavaScript?
Yeah. I don't know how. I don't ask questions on how it's made. It's hard enough to figure out, for me at least, to figure out how things work rather than like how it's built. With regards to data flow, note that data is unidirectional, meaning that data is going to flow downwards. So it's like all of your centralized state is up top, and the data flows down, and the actions that change the data are going to flow upwards. So it's all in one direction. So the way that we've been writing React so far is going to change a little bit. So specifically what's going to change is, number one, where a state lives. Remember, before it was in its own individual component. Now it's going to be inside like a centralized Redux store. And before, we used to change like state by doing like set state, and we rewrite it. But now it's going to be slightly more convoluted. An action's going to trigger a reducer, which is going to update the Redux store, and then the components are then going to set store when set state when the store has been updated. And that doesn't make any sense until we actually see it. So today we're going to write like a counter in Redux, first in regular React, and then we're just going to change it and make it like we're going to Reduxify it. So first things first, I'm just going to do create React app. I'm going to call it maybe counter Redux. So this might take a little bit of time. This might take a lot of time. How did you all like the trading exercise yesterday?
It's fun.
If you have any questions on it, you can ask Rod.
Yeah. How was it? Did you guys do open outcry, market moving around, you trying to make markets? Is that what you guys did?
Yeah,
Sort of, yeah. We were a disaster, pretty much.
Yeah.
Well, you should be. You should be like thoroughly confusing.
Yeah, I ended up short like 1,400 or something. I was totally screwed. But like, it was great because they were going off the dollar bill and like the random numbers for the serial number.
So I've never been in their mock trading. So what do? They put like a ticker of some sort of fake security.
Yeah, I just had like, so dollar bill has a serial number on it.
Yeah.
They had 9 digits, and then they had Jess, who was the HR person, going up, and like each time she would like add 1 digit, and then we would like make markets and like try to trade and sell and buy, and then like once we were done with that round, she'd go and put up the next number. And so we started off with our theoretical value, and
so you had like a sheet with theoretical value.
We would write it down, like every once in a while he would come around and check us to see like what we had currently for our theoretical value, and then we were kind of like making markets based on what we thought, and then it went hard. It went hard high towards the end on like the last 4 digits.
But totally random how it jumped, right?
Yeah, I mean, as far as we know,
Okay.
as much as info as we have on like how the Fed puts out serial numbers, but yeah, but it was kind of interesting. Yeah,
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I didn't understand a single thing they were saying at one point. It was really tough for me. I was like, oh, I'm intelligent. I could definitely pick up this real quick. And then they started talking. I was like, I have no idea what any of these concepts are.
Yeah, I'm selling way too much too early. And
At least it wasn't Bitcoin, so. And how many was it? You guys and a couple traders and Jess?
No, it was the 4 of them, Jess, and then
senior financial
not a senior
engineer, right?
No, just a senior engineer. Yeah, he's a team lead there named Greg. It was the Professor Greg that they were talking about when CTC came in to present.
But is an engineer one of their quants?
I don't think so.
No,
I thought quant is someone who's like math heavy.
Yeah. Typically, they distinguish the roles. There's a ton of lead one way or the other, but typically they're financial engineers or the quants. And then they have software engineers or the developers.
I couldn't remember if they said senior dev or engineer was called one of their quants. I couldn't that's what I was kind of confused.
I thought quant was like the mathematical geniuses that they get out of.
Typically,
but I think they call them financial engineers, and so he was like senior engineer. So I thought maybe that's what that meant.
Okay.
I wasn't positive. Probably should have asked that question.
It was scary.
I thought about that last night. I was like, was he a dev or was he a financial engineer? Like, he was pretty good at it. He knew, he definitely knew what he was talking about.
Yeah. How do you guys like CTC in general?
It's good. Like, really cool office. Like, interviewees or interviewers were great. Yeah, it was cool.
All right. Let's continue on. Let's create a counter app. Right. So we'll change a few things. I'll just have a little button, and then when I click the button, it'll like the amount of times that it's been counted will go up, and the amount of times that it has been counted will also go down. So I'll have so just, I guess, tell me where to start. Like, what would you want to get started with? Like, so I want to have 2 buttons on the page. One says increment, one says decrement, and maybe somewhere in the middle I'll have a counter going up and down, like an actual number going up and down.
Build the buttons first.
Build the buttons. All right, we'll get something. We'll call this counter app or something like that. We'll get rid of this altogether. We'll create 2 buttons. We'll just call this increment, and we'll close off the button. And then we'll have another button that says decrement. All right. Doesn't do anything, that's fine. All right. So I have those 2 buttons. I want to make sure that I'm keeping track of like how many times something has been clicked, like the counter itself. So what do I need to do to get that set up?
Do you need to build an initializer?
I probably do. Yeah. So let's build a constructor. Takes in some props. So first thing that I'm going to super the props, and then you said I need some sort of state, right?
Yeah, we want to counter.
Start with 0.
Sure.
Okay. All right, and then I'm going to just have a little section right here for maybe an H1 to make it really big. And then I just want to say
this was squigglies for the JavaScript.
Okay. This state
counter.
Okay. All right, so it's 0. This doesn't do anything. This doesn't do anything. Fantastic. Now we have 2 buttons. When I click it, I want this to go up. When I click this, I want it to go down. How would I go from there?
Like a button on click.
Sure. So we'll create 2 on clicks. Yeah, you guys are picking this up pretty quick. That's great. So an on click for this. Let's just start with an on click for going up. All right.
This state counter plus plus.
Nope.
Oh yeah.
Set state.
I do need to set state, but I don't want to set state directly on this. So what would I need to do?
I'll pass the prop in and give it to.
Well, I mean, I could do that, but it's like I want to separate I don't want the render to do everything, right? So when I click on this, I can create another function. Yeah. So when I create custom functions, I'll have this handle increment or something. And then you said this, so all I'm going to do is this dot set state equals counter this dot state dot counter plus 1.
Plus equals 1.
I don't know. Let's see. I think
Oh yeah.
I think that works. Yeah. Okay. And then how do I call it down here? This dot handle increment. Anything else? All right, we'll start with that. Let's see if this goes up. All right, reload for me. Nothing is happening and everything blows up. Cannot read state of undefined. What's the issue that we're finding here? I do need to pass an arrow function or I need to bind. Basically, inside of render, I'm saying this, which refers to the whole app right here. I'm going to call handle increment as a function. Inside of handle increment, there's another reference to this, which is now out of the scope. So I can do 2 things. I can either do dot bind this, at which point this should work. I can up increment. Oh no. Nothing's working. This dot set state counter. Don't believe so.
Do you have to open close parentheses on functions in JavaScript? On handle increment?
Handle increment. Like this? I don't believe so. Because this will, what this is saying, if you automatically have this right here, these 2 parentheses are going to execute it immediately when it loads, not even when it's clicked. So I only want this to execute when I click it. So by having this right here right now, I'm actually automatically invoking it. That's not what I want to do. I think we did this incorrectly. I think it's just this. Let's find out. There we go. Nice. So we can either bind it like this, or we can do a fat arrow function like Alex was talking about. And then I don't need this binding to this. Refresh for me. Oh. Uh-oh. Did I mess something up, Alex?
You might need to. Oh,
Oh, I think it's this.
Oh.
I forgot. I need one more. Is that right?
Sure, we can do that. Call it with parentheses inside there.
Call it with parentheses inside of here. Should I keep these curly braces on here?
Yeah.
All right. Well, maybe that's it. Okay.
Oh, wow, it does matter, John. Plus 5 for John.
All right. And with that same thing, what we're going to do is we're going to copy this again, and we're going to have another one called handle decrement. All right, and we'll just copy this whole thing. Decrement, and then we'll just subtract 1. Pretty simple. We got something that goes up, something that goes down. I like it. I think I messed something up. Oh, yes, I copied too much. Let's see if that fixed it. There we go. Goes up, goes down. Everything looks good. All right, so if you take a look at the code inside of here, you can see that we're setting state like usual directly on inside the component. And this is totally fine for a super small application, but imagine if you wanted to display this particular counter on several different pages of your application, right? How could you share the state of this particular component with other parts of our app? And that's where Redux becomes useful. So first things first, I'm just going to kill this server. I'm going to do npm install -- save for Redux. This should be pretty quick. And at that point, I'm going to run npm start.
What do we do with the create React app? Is create React something Redux?
So it's, remember when you do like Rails new or something like that? Yeah, it's a create React app, whatever the name of the project is. I called it counter Redux. You can call it poop. It's up to you.
Like, what is counter Redux?
All right, so we've installed it. It's inside of our package.json as a dependency now. As you can, I just spilled all over myself. As you can see here inside of the dependencies, now we have Redux, any version above 3.7.2. All right, so let's get this all set up. There's a few things that we need to do every single time. First things first, we need to create a store.js file. We'll leave it empty for now. We'll come back to this in just a little bit. We're going to need a modules folder. And inside this module, we're going to create something called counter.module.js. Each, like whatever you want to keep track of the state with, you're going to just do whatever that you want to keep track of, .module.js. Now, there's a few different file structures that people have developed to help organize the different patterns of Redux, but we're going to be going with the structure known as ducks. The way that they're organizing is called ducks, and it's you may think it's something very like there's some sort of significance behind it, but it really just is because Redux has ducks at the end, so they said this is the ducks way of like organizing code. It's very, very primitive. I like to think of another way. It's like I want to keep all my ducks in a row. This is just the way that they decided to name it. All right, so to get all of our ducks in a row, we're going to need to create inside of this counter.module, we're going to need to keep track of our action creators, action types, action creators, and reducers. So inside of this is Redux for one particular, this is like the Redux for one particular part of our application. There are specific action types that a user can take. You have to think of all the different types of things that the user can do. For us, we're going to create two consts. One's called increment counter and decrement counter. These are the only two actions types that some user can take on our website. That's pretty much all they can do. They can increment the counter and decrement the counter because we have a very simple counter going up and down. Next, we're going to have action creators, and those are basically functions that can take in information and return objects that are formatted to be sent into Redux's states. This is what it looks like right here. I have two functions. Basically, they say once the once somebody takes a particular action, I'm going to create a function out of it and then pass it down into the reducer. We're going to need an initial state after this. I'm sorry, I forgot. And this initial state, I'm just going to say like, what's the initial state for the entire section that I want the Redux store to take care of? And for us, it's just going to be counter is going to be 0 to get started. And then finally, we have the reducer. And this is where most of the action takes place. The reducer is basically like the action taker, the one who actually makes state changes happen. A reducer is called a pure function. And what a pure function is basically a function that takes in one object and returns another one. That's all it does. So the reducer is going to take our old state, also called previous state, and then return out the new state. If at the very basic level, it looks something like this. A reducer is just a function that takes some sort of previous state and then returns some sort of new state. That's it. It takes in one object and puts out another one. That's all a pure function is. So this is what it looks like on a very basic level. But for us, it's going to look a little more complicated, and we'll go line by line. So what we've got here is a const called reducer. This is going to be a function that we made it into a fat arrow function. It's going to take in the previous state, which by default is going to be the initial state in case there is no previous state. It's going to take in a previous state, an action, and then it runs through all of this code here. First thing on this line 14, it creates a new state, which is a copy of the old state. And because remember that Redux state is immutable, we need to create a copy of it first. So this spread function is basically saying we have a constant variable called new state, which is equal to all of the old state. And based on the action type that's being passed in, if it's like an increment counter, I'm going to say the new state has a counter key on there, which is going to be the previous state's counter +1, and then we're going to return that out to the screen. And if the default is if we don't have any of these case statements, we're just going to return the previous state. I'm going to change one thing real quick, just to also account for the decrement. So I'm just adding another line. So this reducer is going to receive a previous state of some sort. It's going to receive some sort of action. Based off of that, it's going to create a new state for us. If it's an increment counter, I'm just going to increment the counter on, I'm going to increment the counter key here. And if it's a decrement, I'm going to decrement the counter. And of course, since we want to use this reducer outside of this here, I'm going to do export default of reducer. Now I'm going to stop here because this is where I got super lost yesterday. I just want to see how people are feeling about this.
No, what are the, okay, start with action created. Why does it have parentheses around? It looks like a arrow function.
Sure. So that's something really cool that I found out. So you know how usually you have to explicitly return something? So it technically should look like this, return, it should look like that, right? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm missing one more. So when you have a fat arrow function, you have the parameter, the fat arrow, and then the code that is supposed to be executed within these curly braces, right? And usually when you execute some sort of code, you need to have an explicit return. This is one way of writing it. ES6 actually provides you with these parentheses. It says one of those small things I didn't know until yesterday. These parentheses on the outside of the curly braces is an implicit return. So instead of writing code like this, these two things are synonymous. These two things are synonymous. It just this parentheses on the outside means that you don't have to actually have this explicit return. It's just a small little shortcut. So we'll go back to the way things were. There we go. So this is basically return this thing here. that is all that increment counter is going to do. So again, so the way that this works is like a user goes onto your website. They click. That click event goes to a dispatch. No, maybe this is too much for right now because we haven't gotten there quite yet. We haven't done dispatch or anything like that. But does this kind of make sense? It doesn't have to be like 100% mastery, but it's kind of like the way that I organize this Redux file is all the actions that a user can possibly take on that particular section. Then the code that goes along with like actually creating that particular action, initial state, and then the reducer is the main meat of it, which is like all the stuff that's going to happen when, oh, it's snowing. That's cool. A little bit. It's light. It's light. This reducer is basically just going to like actually execute the code for us.
So we don't have to export the reducer function?
It's down here.
Oh.
All right, so this is like the main meat of everything. Like this is what's going to happen when we start updating things. So the next thing, we need to actually create the store, like the centralized database of things that could possibly happen. So our store file should read a little something like this. First line, I'm importing create store. It's a library from Redux. I'm importing the reducer from this counter.module that I just created over here. So this entire function is available to me now inside of store. And then I'm going to create a constant called store, which is going to create a store from the Redux library using this particular reducer. So this reducer has like all of my particular cases of things that could happen. And I'm creating a store from the Redux library with those particular cases. And you may be wondering why we don't, like, why did we write all of this code inside of here only to import it on this tiny little file? Like, why don't we just copy all this code and dump it inside of here? Right now, we only have one reducer, as you can see here, and one possible set of actions, which is our counter. Once your larger application starts to take hold, you're going to have more than one reducer. Right now, we're only doing one thing for counter. But later down the road, if you can think about your news article, there are many different actions that you can take. Thus, you will have many different reducers, which is why you have a particular store to take care of all of this.
I'm guessing it'll change the names. They will all be called reducer.
Yeah, they would probably be called something else. Like right now, it's only reducer because we only have one reducer, but you might want to call like counter reducer and then like add article reducer and like delete article reducer or something like that.
And then there would be a reducer for each action and not just each component?
There is, so this particular, so it's like, the way that I understand it, it's like, so this module is like called counter, right? So it's all things revolving around the counter part of your application. I'm guessing there would be another module around larger things called like adding article or something like that, and deleting article, or maybe there would be like an article module. Like those are all the different possible actions you can take around articles. Right now for us, we're just dealing with one particular counter. There's only two actions that this counter can do, which is go up and go down, which is why we organized it like this. All right, so next.
Can we go back to the last file?
Sure.
Where are those functions? I'm sorry, back to the reducer file.
Sure.
Yeah, where are the functions increment counter and decrement counter being called?
We will call them within app.js.
Okay, so we're using that.
So we've defined it here, but we haven't actually, we're not calling it yet. So we've like, here's all the possible like functions that we could use, and that we haven't used it yet. We're about to import it.
We're going to need to export them as well?
No, because so they're already exported on this line and this line, and they're used inside of reducer, as you can see here, and then we've exported those.
Constants, right?
Yeah, those are the constants. Yeah.
But I missed the export in front of const for the functions. So,
yeah.
Okay. Cool. Perfect.
All right. So next, let's import this store. So we've created this store which contains all the stuff for reducer right here. So we're going to import that store. So we're going to do import we'll call it store from, I think it's just store, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's it. All right. In the constructor of our component, instead of like hard coding our state like this, like we created our own individual JavaScript object right here. What we're going to do is use it to, we're going to say store.getState just to get started. So saying instead of I'm going to hard code it myself, I'm going to go to the store, which is right over here, and I'm going to tell it to get the state. That's something that's given to us for free from this create store. So the state is going to look inside of this initial state, and then that's where we get started. All right, let's do a quick console log real quick, just to see that we get what this .state looks like. There it is. I have an object. That object is not doing exactly what I wanted. Did I mess something up? We're going to import. I think I did everything correctly. Let's see. Yep, there it is, sorry. Counter is going to be equal to 0. So inside of our constructor here, once this app loads onto the page, we're setting the state to be whatever the store state is. You're going to go inside the store, which is inside this file, inside of get state. Get state doesn't really exist inside of here. It comes for free with this create store, which will go inside my reducer. My reducer is going to look into my initial state, and that's where this comes in. Like, again, if I change this to 10 and I refresh this page, there's my counter is going to be 10. So it takes the store's initial state instead of whatever you hard coded it to be. Great, so this works. And now we need to hook up the action creators. Remember these action creators, it's like, when are we going to use these? We want to be using these. So our buttons are still changing like component level state right now. It's still going like based off of like whatever is on this component, and it's working correctly. But instead, we want to use our handle methods to change the state of the store rather than this particular component. So what we're going to do is we're just going to get rid of all of this and this. We're just going to say store.dispatch increment counter. So I'm telling the store to say, I want you to fire off the increment counter method, which is found over here. So the store is going to receive the increment method to be invoked, which will take us to counter.module. And inside that, you can see that this action creator is going to return an action object. This whole thing is just one giant object. And then that object is then dispatched or sent in layman's terms to the reducer down here, which will change the initial state of this entire store. It is very convoluted. And if we had gotten to Redux Day 2, you would have seen there's something called React Redux, which takes a lot of this away. So this is like pure Redux. I'm just taking the library itself and shoving it in here. But there's no shortcuts, but there is something called React Redux that takes care of that for us. But there's an issue. It says increment counter is not defined right here. Any ideas of what we should do to get that in here?
You need import, what's it called?
Yep.
Counter module.
Increment. I actually need to import this particular import from here.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So
I'm probably gonna use the other one too, so you should probably bring it with.
Yep, I'm gonna do that. Counter.module. So I need the increment counter. I need the decrement counter as well. Okay. All right. So So we're no longer using state for our regular stuff. Let's see, handle increment, a handle decrement. All right, so these two are still good. And we're dispatching it. Let's see if anything changes. And nothing is going up and nothing is going down. Why do you? So we got increment counter. Let's see, increment counter and decrement counter. Yeah. So at this point, we've changed our state on our app.js. We've changed what's inside the guts of the handle increment and handle decrement to, instead of us manually changing it, we are letting the store take care of that now. But right now, this particular component is not subscribed to the store. So it's like not connected to the store in any way. So what we need to do inside of our, so we need to basically subscribe this particular component up to the store. So we're going to create a new method for the component did mount. This is one of those life cycle methods. Remember, like the before actions and after actions for Rails controllers. Once this particular component loads onto the screen and mounts onto the DOM, we are going to subscribe. So store has a method built in on it called subscribe, which is basically going to say, like, I want to basically keep track of anytime that you change your state, I want to set my state equal to yours. So can I go up? Can I go down? There we go. So just this one tiny line, now I'm subscribing to the store. So whenever the store updates, my individual component will also reflect that. And one last little bit I want people to know, even though you're probably not going to use this today, is when right now I'm fully subscribed. This component is fully subscribed to the store, which is good. That's what we want. But if I were to move on to a different section of the page, this is still connected to the store. So once this unmounts onto it, I want to unsubscribe. So I'm going to have a component will unmount. So once like this is off the screen and I no longer need it at all, I want to unsubscribe from it. So I'm going to change this real quick. I'm just going to do this, not unsubscribe. All right, so if all goes well,
you have to go back to get state. Like, the extra. Oh no, that's.
Yeah.
Sorry. It's just a lot of this.
Yep. All right, so you may be thinking this is a lot of extra work for the same simple counter that I created in like 5 seconds a little bit earlier. But you're not wrong. This initial setup of Redux is extraordinarily laborious, but as your app is going to grow and get larger and larger, and you add more features, you add more components, and you add more pages and things like that, managing state becomes really simple because there's one centralized location. And that one centralized location means that I know exactly where all the state lives. I know everything that's happening to it, rather than going like, oh, what's the state of this particular component? And I have 15 components. I have to find each individual one and try to modify it. So yeah, that's a basic, very, very rudimentary introduction into Redux. Any questions on anything before I let you all try it yourself?
There's still a place to have local states.
Absolutely, yeah. If you're just doing like a simple counter app or something like that, there's absolutely no reason why you should set up Redux. This is just more for educational purposes right now. That's why we set it up for Redux.